story that goes with that. But,
and it seems that it's fundamentally the desire of fundamentalists to have as much control as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So who's playing into whose hand here? I mean, are the fundamentalists right folks playing into the hands of the corporations, or the corporation playing in the hands of the fundamentalists right?
I'll tell a biblical story, because I really think that it sums it all up. In the Bible, there's this wonderful little story of Joseph. And Joseph is thrown in prison. He's betrayed by his brothers. He's thrown in prison. But he has this talent, and that is he can interpret dreams. Well, while in prison, he interprets some dreams of some folks in prison. Well, one guy gets up, and he's serving Pharaoh. He's serving the empire. And Joseph is still in prison. The Pharaoh is having nightmares. And the guy says, hey, there's this guy in prison that can interpret your dream. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. And that's the famous story where Joseph says to Pharaoh, look, there is a huge famine coming on the land. You need to save the people. And if you simply you're living in good times now, you're living in surplus. If you store away the grain, when the famine hits, give it to the people. Flash forward, it's in the future. Pharaoh has put Joseph in charge of the surplus machine. So Joseph winds up being seduced by the Pharaoh and seduced by the privileges of empire. The famine hits. Joseph betrays the people. And when the people come to get the grain, he says, no. First you give me your livestock. And they come back and they say, we still need food. And he goes, no, now you give me, you give Pharaoh your land. And they come back a third time and he says, give me your labor, give me your bodies. I will enslave you to Pharaoh, but I'll feed you. The Genesis ends with the people enslaved by Joseph. But there is one element of the population that's not enslaved. And that's people like me, the priests. And the priests always function to basically protect Pharaoh. And in the Bible, that's the story of empire, is that empire is always, the agenda of empire is always to accumulate total power over people. And the role of religion in the empire is to, in a sense, be the psychological muscle or the spiritual muscle Marx is right, it becomes the opiate of the people. Now, and I'll end with this, because this isn't Bible hour, but there's another narrative in Scripture, the one that I believe Jesus picked up on, certainly the prophets picked up on, and that is this whole narrative in the Bible that talks about how do you resist the Pharaoh? How do you get out of Egypt, so to speak? And what the right-wing Christians have picked up on is how to serve Pharaoh, how to serve the empire, and they do not listen to, nor are they very interested in how do you resist the seductions of empire. So that's a Bible story, and how it connects, I'll tell another story. About 30-something years ago, in the early 1970s, Lewis Powell, who right after he did this was named Supreme Court Justice by Richard Nixon. Lewis Powell was living next door to the head of the Chamber of Commerce, and they got to talking. And they were worried because things weren't going right in America. There were disturbances in America, and so Powell authored a memo. And anyone can look this up. You can just Google it, Powell memo, and you can read it. You don't need to be a lawyer to read it. It's pretty easy to read. And what was in the memo is Powell was directing it and sent it to the CEOs and basically the conservative movement at that time. And what he was talking about was we need to take back the country. We need to create our own academic, our own media infrastructure. And from that point on, what they were worried about was the outbreak of democracy in the country, because that is what was happening in the 60s. You had the gay rights movement, you had the environmental movement, you had the women's movement, you had the civil rights movement, but the one that spooked them the most was the consumer rights movement. And this was early Nader. And they were worried that too much power was beginning to accrue into the hands of common people like us. And so Powell's memo is an attempt to instruct business as to how to take back the power. Mm-hmm. From that memo came the American Heritage Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, this flowering of this infrastructure that now so dominates public discourse in this country. The right-wing think tanks. Yeah. Along the way, they realized early on that there was another component that was strategic, and that is we need to get into the churches. And they created parachurch organizations like the Institute on Religion and Democracy. Still, you know, you can Google it, you can look this stuff up, it's still out there. The point being, where you find the connection is the same foundation money, like the Schaeff Institution and the John Oling Foundation and the Abrahamson Foundation, the same money that was funding these think tanks were also funding these parachurch organizations that were infiltrating particularly mainline congregations or mainline church structures, attempting to diminish their social justice witness. And so there is a linkage, and it can be traced, that the same corporate power that was building up this infrastructure that now so dominates public discourse was also targeting the church. This is what I call the emergence of Christian fascism.